Okay, I think we're live. So welcome everyone to this interactive safety and risk roundtable. If you don't know me, I'm Christian Harris, the founder of Slip Safety Services. We work in safety and risk by driving down slips and falls, which is the biggest cause of accident, injury and claim in most sectors. And I'm also the host of the Safety and Risk Success podcast. Joined today by Colin, Matt and Jonathan, who will do a quick intro to themselves in a minute as well. And today we're going to be addressing the question of who owns risk in your business and who should own risk in your business. So an interesting topic to delve into. If you're watching, please hit like on the stream to show us that you're there. Drop a comment as well, either with name and where you're from or something like that, or a good luck message, or if you've got a question, then put the letter Q and then put the question in and we'll get those answered. In terms of a bit of context, the four of us and Dan Looney, for the last few weeks, we've been doing a weekly slot on Clubhouse, but we thought we'd give the same kind of thing a try on LinkedIn, because we know there are more people on here that will benefit from this and want to join in. So the plan is to do this as a weekly thing. We'll have some topic themes to discuss, but we'd love to get your interaction as well. Basically, we're running a Zoom and live streaming that. So you've got two options to get involved. You can drop a note in the comments, as we said, or if you're feeling brave, you can join us on the Zoom and actually appear on screen with us and have a bit of back and forth conversation. So I'll put the Zoom link into the comments in a minute, and I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to basically try and moderate the chat, because I'll be sort of trying to keep an eye on the comments and things, but do give everybody a follow, connect with us all, like the stream, give us some comments, because that helps the algorithm to know we're talking about something interesting and valuable, and then more people will join us. So over to you, JD.
Thank you, Christian. So I'm Jonathan Dempsey, founder and director of Red Laces Risk Consultancy. We help business leaders to quickly solve problems and develop their strategic capability in risk, health and safety and compliance. And we've been doing a lot of work on social media. So links to our services and social media platforms are all at redlaces.co.uk. And as you've heard, we're actually very active now on Clubhouse. So a lot more opportunity for you actually to come and get engaged with us directly and share your experiences. I'll hand over to Colin to give an introduction.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Yeah, my name's Colin Nottage. I run a health and safety consultancy called IMG, Influential Management Group, and we provide consultancy in the heavy industry. So we do a lot of work within the quarrying industry, manufacturing, engineering, things like that. Also got some online resource that we use with our clients, and also we've got this great process called Project Millennium, which is helping health and safety professionals become better versions of themselves. So that's projectmillennium.com. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll hand over to Matt.
Hi everyone, yeah, Matt Hodges-Long. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Track My Risks. Hopefully it does what it says on the tin. It's a software platform for governance, risk and compliance management, and we work in especially sort of industries like financial conduct, authority regulated sectors, education, and then predominantly now building safety as a result of Grenfell. So we have the dubious pleasure of managing compliance environments for, I think, just over 3,000 buildings across the UK at the moment, and sort of growing pretty rapidly. So trying to get some consistency into that process at the building level and get residents involved and helping them look after their own buildings along with their landlords. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. So over to this question then of who owns risk. There's plenty of content around on what is risk, and here we're kind of talking about risk with a capital R. So we're really looking at how risk affects business, how it affects customers, how it affects profitability, how it affects accidents and injuries and whatever really. So and across this panel, we've got a breadth of experience in lots of different sectors. So we should get some diversity of thought and opinion, but one of the things that brings us together is our sort of passion around risk and risk management. So if we look at who owns risk, and maybe go on to then who should own risk, start Colin, you worked in heavy industry. There'll be lots of different business risks within the sectors that you've covered. What's your view on who owns risk, and what, in terms of how you see that playing out in your interactions?
I think it's a great question, Jonathan. And and I want to give you a little example. Actually, it's probably the easiest way. Is quite a few years ago, I was working for a quarrying company, and we had a contractor, a haulier, who was sheeting a load. Okay, so the material had been put into the back of the lorry, and then at that point in time, there weren't automatic sheets. There were people were having to pull a sheet over the top of the material to keep it secure, but also from an environmental perspective. And the guy fell off the back of the lorry, and the health and safety executive came in and did an investigation. And this was quite early on in my career, and I can remember the HSE saying, well, you're the people that as in the company, you're the people that are expecting the person to sheet their wagon. So you're creating the hazard in the activities and the things that you do. So you're the people that need to come up with the ways of controlling that. So I think it's for me, it's fairly simple. This the company own the risk. Because the risk is there when they are doing the activities, and what they do is they put people close to the risk, and we shouldn't be frightened of that. We shouldn't be frightened of putting people close to risk. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that we've got some really, really great controls to support the people that we're expecting to work alongside the risk. So that's my opening gambit, as it were.
Sure, no. And so, Christian, how do you spend a lot of time in the leisure sector, quite specifically, and of course that's very different from quarrying, but again, people are frontline exposed to risk. So how does your experience compare or differ from what Colin's shared?
I think Colin's absolutely right. The company has got to take responsibility, but of course, we have to empower the team to take some personal responsibility as well. You interviewed Colin Todd Conklin, didn't you? And you had a good conversation about that point, I think, where he was talking about permission to not work or something like that. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was good.
Yeah, what it was we're very, very quick in business to turn around and say to employees, look, if you don't think things are safe, if you don't think things are right, then stop what you're doing, and take that step back. And I suppose the conversation that we were having was that's very, very dependent then on the employee getting it right every single time. And the thing is that we know that people make mistakes, people get things wrong. So in actual fact, what we should be doing as businesses, as business owners, is actually giving people the right to start the work, because we know that we've got the right controls in place. We've considered it, we've thought about it, and so we're actually giving the people the authority to start rather than the option to stop. And I think that was really what we spoke about there.
Yeah, spot on. So I think there's obviously a layer of that as well. I think in the leisure sector, thinking about leisure centres, going back to your question, it's interesting. You've got lots of different business units scattered around the country, potentially with a head office function of varying size in terms of safety. So I've seen everything from Fitness First, who are now no longer operating, so that I'll talk about them. When they had 150 clubs, there was one person in their health, safety and compliance team, all the way through to the likes of Virgin Active, who with a similar number of clubs back in the day had something like 20 people in their team. So I think there's a question here around attitudes as well. But I think in leisure, you've got to all of these sites are slightly different. So you've got to give some authority and autonomy to individual sites and managers as well to own that risk.
Sure. And then Matt, you operate in a world of complexity that's actually quite different from some of the work we do. And you're working with government ministers and with media and with residents and the like. So you see risk playing a slightly different way. How are your experiences very different from this?
So just to clarify, on working with government ministers, we nag government ministers. They don't necessarily like us because we hold them to account with numbers. And I think where I think we've got to be really careful is that I think that we need the framework to operate within, and that I think is the leadership attitude to risk. And then I think the delivery of it, I'm very much a passionate believer that is a ground up, everybody's plays their part. But because of the complexity, what we often find is that senior management will then hide from the detail. So what we're all about is sort of evidencing the behavior, the good behavior, but you need to set the tone of what the expectation is. And I sort of think back to just sort of listening to everyone talk there about sheeting loads and things like that. So my first foray into all of this was 26 or so years ago, when I was a young, excitable site manager on a building site, building houses. And I had a very near miss incident where I did about £200,000 worth of property damage from an accident that we had on the site. Luckily, nobody got hurt. But at that moment, when I was sort of there 2 years into that role, thinking back, I'd never had, from a volume house builder, never had any health and safety training at all. There was no expectation. The expectation was about keeping clean and tidy, delivering on time, but it was never about keeping people alive. Now, obviously, that's a long time ago, but there were no measures. There was no whistleblowing policy. There was no. Now, I'm hoping now in that environment, 25, 26 years later, that would be different. I don't know, but so there's one thing about ticking boxes and saying we've got a health and safety policy, or we've got this COSH assessment, or whatever it is. The other thing is that framework for managing risk actually being routinely applied? Is it a part of the muscle memory of a business? So I would say behavior every time. Show me the measurement that this stuff is actually being done and is being continuously improved. Or is it just some dusty policy that Colin was brought in to write 5 years ago and nobody's ever touched ever since? Is it a healthy way of operating, or is it just a tick box exercise, I think? And that's where the management control comes in, I believe.
Sure.
Probably haven't really answered the question, but
I'm sure it's giving our audience some different perspectives there as well. I think that through some of our conversations, what the audience will hear is that there's a world of complexity, but there's a world of variety. I think the good thing about talking about these things is that it should take away some of the fear and complexity away, and actually get people into a position of being curious. And a phrase that I use quite often is creativity, curiosity, and care. Now, quite often for a leadership team, and a lot of my experience, lots of business functions operate in silos. So HR are expected by the line management to do HR, and finance are expected to look after the pennies, and safety team are expected to look after safety. But if we try to understand what more can we do, and what more do we need to know. For instance, if the board were to say, are we compliant, are we legal, are we safe? It's a binary question, and that actually can put quite a lot of fear into the person asking the question as to, well, the inference is yes, and if you've got a concern, you're just saying there about speaking up, the inference is that you can't speak up and share because it's a leading question. You expected to say there's no problem. Much better at a board level, and then of course you're setting the tone to say, what do I need to know? What more do I need to know about? When we talk about policies and procedures, now more than ever, there's a disconnect, there's a divergence from a policy that was written 2 years ago to the world that we're in now. So risk, I think that's something we can probably look at then, how leisure centres will be opening again soon, Christian. If we look at the risks that you were seeing a year, 2 years ago in the leisure sector at all levels, how do you see those risks now being similar or different? But how do you see the management of them also being similar or different?
I think that both in leisure and other sectors, people are obviously going to be have a heightened awareness about the risks relating to COVID. So the hygiene stuff and the distancing and the PPE. But I'm just hoping that people won't forget the traditional risks that have always been there, because they're still going to be there. They're still going to need to be managed. And if anything, it might be more difficult to manage some of those risks in a post-COVID world with some of the COVID-related control measures. So, for example, if we're going around and I've seen lots of people have contacted me saying, I thought of you yesterday because I went into a building and there was loads of hand sanitizer on the floor. So that's just one example where we've done something from a COVID perspective to be COVID secure, if you like, or that term. But we've introduced something else that's heightened some of these other risks. So I think, people will need to be aware that the risks have expanded, but not to forget those original risks as well.
Sure. And a slightly different tact, Colin. I mean, all three of you are actually podcasters. I'm the odd one out here. But again, you're interviewing different guests. Do you see risk coming up as a theme, emerge as a theme within your conversations? And how have you maybe seen some of those perceptions change over the last couple of years through your podcast?
Okay, yeah, I think risk is very much sort of, I suppose, the fundamental thing that you need to consider, in the workplace, and it covers so many different, not just health and safety, it covers so many other things. And I suppose just going back to a point that Christian was making there about whether there was one person in the health and safety department or 20 people in the health and safety department. Hopefully that isn't a measure that you use on how successful a business is, looking to implement and apply health and safety, because the size of the health and safety department really shouldn't be, it should be how engaged are the management team, how engaged are the senior managers, how engaged are the directors, how engaged are the employees. And the health and safety department really should be enablers. They should be people that are looking to facilitate the successful outcome of a task. And I actually feel that the health and safety maybe it should be more rounded, and people should be considering all kinds of risks, environmental, quality, financial, many different aspects, and it's so I think that's where the
nigger, shut up, nigger, stupid ass nigger, fuck you, nigger.
So that's
your dad dies a cancer.
Yeah,
that's the thing that we need to be considering. So, I don't know if you can do anything about that, Christian.
Yeah,
we're just removing a few arse wipes from the stream, so thank you for joining, guys.
That's always the risk, I think, of having an open link.
Yeah, that's true.
It adds to the entertainment value, doesn't it? So apologies for anybody that was upset by the language that they might have heard. I think on jumping on the podcast that I've done, I mean, it's sort of because it's the Risk Guru podcast. It's sort of deliberately I was trying to get to people that had sort of different views on risk. So one of the greatest ones I did was with a vicar, a local vicar, who turns out that he's an ex padre from the army and had been blown up by a roadside bomb in Afghanistan and all that sort of fascinating guy. And then that was followed up by the guy that used to run the Brigade of Gurkhas, a different chap, this colonel, and sort of talking about the way that the army deals with risk and understands risk and has their duty holders, and that was really good. But the most touching one for me was interviewing a lady called Jill Koenig, who used to live in Grenfell Tower, and she moved out a couple of years before the fire. But she is a leader in sort of health and safety, cultural change globally. And her stories of what she saw on that night from her new home, looking back to Grenfell and the people that she knows and what's happened in the years since, was just so incredibly moving. It sort of shows you quite what can happen when you get it wrong and when you marginalize your customers. So whether it's employees or it's residents, and you don't listen to them and you don't heed the warnings and you almost just patronize them by saying that they don't, they don't exist or you don't care. It was really humbling for me and sort of set me on the path of what we've been doing for the last few years, really sort of listening to Jill. So it's back to the behavior that is so important. I'm getting kind of freaked out by a dog on the screen now, but back to you, JD, I think.
Yeah, thank you. One of the areas that I don't hear, or I rarely hear of business referred to, is designing in risk management or designing in risk. So we'll find out what you guys think. But I tend to hear of risk being a cost to be avoided, as opposed to be a source of innovation, except if you look at something like what used to be the R&D function, where you can have a play, you can be innovative and whatever. I've taken some examples from logistics, for instance, where I've spent a lot of time in more recent years with some household names. Quite often, there'll be some brand new sites being developed, with automation and the like. And quite typically, there'll be a whole load of functions on there that will be designing in. They'll choose the location, they'll choose the orientation of the site, they'll choose the design, they'll put everything in, and probably in the weeks, if not days before commissioning, the health and safety team will be invited to come and have a look at some plans and write some risk assessments to make sure the operations are safe on go live. And quite typically, and I've seen this in a few businesses within logistics, quite often the health and safety team are really left till quite late to get involved. So they're trying to manage, and quite often you'll find that the staircase isn't where it's supposed to be because we have to shave a few feet off to fit some automation in. The doors aren't going to quite close where they should. So your fire safety plan and strategy is probably different from what we envisage. And of course, when you get on site, it looks very different from the drawings, as opposed to collaborating very early on and designing in risk. So getting a shared understanding about what's the latest innovation in thinking around fire safety engineering, around safety, around risk, around how it's actually going to work in practice. Do you see, and do you hear many people yourselves using that mindset of collaborating cross-functionally to design risk management into a business to save the short-termism and the firefighting almost at the last minute? Maybe we'll start with Colin on this one.
Okay, it's interesting. Designing in risk. When you were saying designing in risk, I was a little bit worried then. I thought, but when you used the word management, I was more comfortable. I think I do a lot of work in construction, and construction has got some legislation, CDM, and that does put an emphasis on the designer to actually design out the risk, and there's different success and failures in that. I also chair the Construction Dust Partnership, and so we're heavily looking at raising awareness of construction dust, because that kills far more people than typical safety issues in construction sites, and it often gets overlooked. But getting the designer to when they're designing a workplace, a building or something like that, to have the right number of curbs, so you haven't got to start cutting curbs, or paving slabs designed in such a way so you're not having to do those cuts, or having them manufactured off site in certain shapes so that so it can be actually manufactured in a controlled environment rather than it actually gets out to the building site. I think there is more and more success of that happening, but it takes time. But I think just on your point about getting the health and safety department involved soon enough, I think I'd like to look at it just a little bit differently, because to be fair, health and safety professionals aren't necessarily the people that are best placed to actually come up with the solutions. But I think as long as health and safety is considered early enough in the process, then it doesn't matter who's there. It doesn't have to be the health and safety department. It needs to be considered by the people often that are going to be utilizing the workplace or the equipment or whatever it may be afterwards. So I'd much rather have the people that are going to be using the space involved in the process, rather than calling in a health and safety specialist who may not know anything about it. So I
just did an interview for the podcast this morning, and with a software technology company, and they've developed quite a clever tool to kind of manage and mitigate various types of risk, and it's all about being built with the perspective of the end user, the operative, in mind. So this is designed for cleaners and security guards and people like that to be using it. So actually making it usable and enjoyable to use for them, and then they can shape what it looks like, rather than sort of something that's kind of pushed down from on high without really consulting their thoughts.
I'll just jump in on the whole silos thing, because listening there to talking about the health and safety viewpoint and all the other stuff, but if we look at something like fraud risk, for example, if we look at the totality of risk and say, okay, we can go and design a really great solution that stops people from getting killed, but it could well pop up with a huge exposure to fraud somewhere else. And that happened recently post-Grenfell, where the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors created a survey process because banks weren't lending. So they looked at it from a lending perspective and said, okay, what do we need to go out and do? What do we need our surveyors to do? And they created a form. They quite obviously didn't think through how a fraudster might weaponize that system. So it was full of insecurity in the same way that we see in cyber, where we look at sort of privacy by design and cybersecurity, etc. That, you know, you could go and do something that's really good commercially, but it leaves your company wide open to a cyber attack. A bit like having open links on Zoom, that kind of thing. Idiots turn up. So when you speak to people and they say, "Oh, well, we didn't consider that," and you think, well, that's just one vector of risk that we do need to make sure we're consulting everybody around the organization around a particular design of a product or a process. And I think I'm really keen on sort of diversity of opinion. So you might turn around and think, well, we do this. Why would we ever consider speaking to a fraud person? And you think, well, you don't know what you don't know. So therefore, even if you've got different aspects of this, so fraud and criminality, you've got health and safety, you've got financial risk, etc. Get a view, even if that department says, look, I don't think this has got any impact on us, but fine, happy, let it go. At least you've consulted. So having that residual way or that systemic way of making sure that you consult with all of the stakeholders before you go and do something, I think is really important. It sort of breaks down those silos as well. So I think if you could be talking about risk management in its broadest sense, not just the sort of insurers saying, well, we do risk management, which means we do a health and safety audit. Well, no, that's just because you're considering that particular peril. That's where your claim is going to come from, but that isn't actually what risk management is. It's a component of managing risk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Completely
separating hazards and risk, I think, is a good point.
Sure. We've had a couple of comments and questions from some people. So shall I dive in and just put those to people? So Gary has asked, sort of interesting to hear what we're talking about leisure sites. A few hotel chains have franchising agreements, and that basically means that a few further layers of complexity related to risk ownership, and the franchise agreement usually has the kind of bare minimum relating to health and safety. Is that he's asked me, is that my experience? But anyone else that's operated in a franchise model, is that your experience as well? I would say that that's a fair comment from what I've seen.
I think it's a totally fair comment. I think a lot of franchise agreements are very much very, very good at outlining maybe the level of service and the financial rewards, but don't always consider some of the other aspects. And like Matt was talking about this. So there's so many more other things other than health and safety to consider as well. So.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also you have to have, I guess, some autonomy in your business. If you're a business owner and you've got a franchise, the franchisor probably can't expect to kind of impose every single last thing on you. Otherwise, you're not really running a business. You're basically an employee, aren't you?
I think with franchises, it's important that you might be able to park the legal liability or the legal risk, but you're not absolving yourself of the reputational risk.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that's often overlooked. I saw it with a hotel chain where they sort of said, well, we don't worry about that many thousand hotels because they're franchises. And I said, well, it's your name above the door, isn't it? So when you kill 20 people in the Legionella outbreak, it's not the XYZ franchising hotels number 12 limited that everybody remembers. It's the big brand name.
Your brand, yeah.
Killed X people. Now, it's a legal nicety that actually your legal entity didn't, the other one did, but that's not what the press are going to print. And that's not what's going to be remembered. So, I think I would just look at it as there's a legal liability difference, but reputationally we're all in it together. It's my name above the door. It's my job to make sure this is being managed properly. And that's back to oversight again, without controlling exactly how they deliver their business. And I think that's the same with leisure centres. Quite often they're owned by local councils, run by under contract, but it's still the Wandsworth Council asset, or Basildon, or wherever it is.
Yeah.
Just so happens to have an operator that's operating it.
Yeah, absolutely. Gary's got a question actually as well, another question, which I think is an interesting one that maybe brings us on to the question of who should own risk in the business. So he says health and safety risks are mostly considered operational and therefore not strategic. Have any of you experience of health and safety being deemed worthy, or should that be strategic enough to be on the board assurance framework?
If I go with this one first, then my suggestion and approach has been, certainly in corporate roles previously, has been to have a strategy around operational and safety and environmental risks that is owned by the board, and so keeping it very high level, but then working out and getting ownership and agreeing and buying into of what are the main areas of risk that we're going to focus on. So if we take logistics, for instance, workplace transport is going to be the number one risk, the major source of fatality and major injury. Working at height will be number 2. Contractor safety will be number 3. Manual handling probably number 4, and then struck by or it could be number 5. So having that owned at a strategic level by the board means the whole business can align around those priorities. So the workplace safety doesn't come down to the health and safety team doing an audit. It comes down to the fleet departments. It comes down to operations, engineering. It comes down to IT, if we're looking at putting in-cab solutions and that kind of thing. So all of a sudden you start to collaborate and you start to align resources across the whole business, and even down to HR and the like. And then the technical part, it might come down to the health and safety team in terms of the more specialist and frontline type stuff. But if it starts at a strategic level, what you can then do is align your resources to it, as opposed to it being, reporting on the number of accidents and incidents that's a lagging indicator.
I think as well, I mean, just touching on that, I think that it's often, there is a strategic statement that's made, but it doesn't actually hold much water, and it's statements like, health and safety is our number one priority, or our target is 0, or our vision is 0, and all these things that come out. And there should always be, maybe, in reality, if people really, really challenged it, it would be unless. There'd be a word, health and safety is our number one priority, unless. And that's the reality of it, because production gets in the way, profit gets in the way, whatever it may be, and so people don't see it through. And so if people don't see it through and they don't really believe in it, then the people in the business won't believe in it either. And so I think you have to be very, very careful about the statements that boards make, and what statements they do make. They've got to live by it, and they've got to believe in it, and they've got to want it. And there's nothing to say that you need to be the best and the safest company in the world. You decide on where you want to be, but then what you want to do is you then want to live and breathe wherever you want to be. And and then people will come and work with you and work alongside you, maybe dependent on those values that you have. So that's a little bit that I put in.
Yeah, whenever I hear health and safety is our number one priority, I just think, no, I'm not. I don't really think that is true. I think because actually, you have of course you have a legal obligation to be safe, but actually, your legal obligation as a business director is to maximize shareholder value, which isn't necessarily the same thing as being safe. I do think people believe it. I think that's what people want to do, but I think, as you say, Colin, they're not choosing the right words. They should be saying that we have a commitment to ensuring high levels of safety, or something like that, and then that's something that's achievable and then they can follow through on. But saying it's the number one priority just rings an alarm bell for me.
I think the commitment should be around how they engage with the workforce. The commitment should be that we will talk and we will communicate and we will discuss and and all these things, and and build this environment where people can be open and honest, and there's lots of trust, and that's where it should be. And if you get that, then the other benefits will come. James McPherson, the legend himself, has put a comment on which is a follow-up, I suppose, to that, although he made the comment a while ago. But his question was, it's about communication. Do you think that making the language and approach to risk holistic across the business would help a business perform better? So, for example, finance do risk assessments all the time, but is that the same language or even method within reason as safety or brand or investment, etc.? So, how we communicate and having a more holistic approach, is that the way forward?
I think it ties. It's a great question from James. Actually, I was going to raise it if you didn't. It's just ultimately, I think if we look at board level in a company, they're all about managing risk anyway. There's risk associated with everything, and it's about risk management. They might not talk about it like that, but you're making investment decisions. You're looking at potential for non-payment. You're looking at your health. You don't want to kill people or injure people, so that's another risk. I think having the culture correct across the business that says, yeah, it's quite right for finance, as James said, finance are looking at counterparty risk or exchange rate fluctuations, etc. All of those things should roll up into a dynamic risk register for the board. And when I talk about that, it isn't the usual kind of crappy Excel spreadsheet with 10 rows on it and a bit of red, amber and green that is made up largely based on, it needs to be evidence driven, and that needs to be a roll up of all of the granular activity that's happening all the way through the organization. So whether that's operating company level, whether it's department level, whether it's divisional, ultimately all of this is going to roll up to a board view, depending on how big the company is. And I see the health and safety risk as one strand of that overall risk management process. Mm-hmm. I suppose we start getting into enterprise risk management and things like that, but it's really important that we've got the real detail being taken care of in relation to health and safety in the same way that we do with finance, risk, etc. I want to know, if I was the CEO of that big company, that all of those departments are operating like a well-oiled machine that ultimately rolls up to a managed risk level for the business, which is within tolerance. But rarely do you see, from what I've seen, that kind of mature conversation about risk taking place on boards, because it always gets sort of dragged into the weeds of the detail of, what was that risk assessment done in accordance with British Standard XYZ, as opposed to saying, have we got our shit together as a business?
Is that a failing of whoever it is that's kind of the intermediary then, whether that's the health and safety manager or director or the risk management director or whoever it might be? Is that?
I think it's silos. I think we've talked about it before. It's finance director looks after these risks and operations director is responsible for those risks or whatever. There's rarely somebody that's looking across. The closest I see of coming to it are where you've got a sort of a free range business continuity person that's looking at all the stuff that might go wrong and they're cutting across all those different silos. But quite often they're left buried in a department somewhere fairly junior, and scrabbling to get heard. But I think it's a strategic role really to make sure that all of these interactions are working harmoniously, and we're breaking down the silos.
You're so right there, Matt. And I think a health and safety professional, they're much better asking a question of to the HR person, who's recently been promoted, who's new to the role, or asking the operations guy, which department is ahead of target, or which department is behind target, because you're gonna find so much more out than going and actually saying, well, we need to do a risk assessment on making this particular piece of equipment. You really want to get into the hearts and minds of the business, because that's where decisions are being made on a daily basis by people that have an impact. So that's
Gary's just asked another question actually about where are we? Metrics and KPIs about giving in information to the board. So, leading versus lagging. He says, I work in the NHS, and I've heard, not in his trust, he hastens to add, that when a patient safety incident occurs, the board communicates that patient safety is priority. A year later, they've suffered this major information governance breach, and then they communicate that patient's information is priority. In other words, reacting, but then not doing much about it. So what are views on that?
Well, I'll jump in. I think that's classic kind of responding to stimuli, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the same things happened after Grenfell, because Grenfell was a certain height building with a certain type of cladding on it. The whole narrative is about that's the biggest issue, but then ignores 90% of the other issues, that it wasn't the same shape. So you're tactically being dragged from one incident to another, rather than looking at the strategic risk and actually saying that all of these things cannot be our top priority because they are mutually exclusive. So you've got a top priority for this 3 months and then a top priority for the next 3 months or whatever the time is, or stopping bad stuff from happening wherever possible is your strategic priority, of which information governance is one, not killing patients is another, and these are the processes that we have. Or it's the top priority for each of those governing departments. But yeah, at the board level, I think it's just BS when you're just putting out a press release, aren't you, to say this terrible thing happened and it's our number one priority to make sure it doesn't happen again. Without
what it comes down to, Matt, is it really comes down to people not knowing how work is done. That's really what we're saying here. And and if an event happens that results in somebody being injured or killed, or a job goes swimmingly well and the business makes an absolute fortune, the people at the top of the business really don't know how that's happened. They've got a perception, they've got an idea, but but it's really about fundamentally finding that out. That is the role that I see of people, is to go out there and find out how work is done and look at that. And once you know that and you're comfortable with that, then you've done what you need to do from a risk management perspective.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I think if you look at my sort of niche area and you say, well, slips and falls, year after year, biggest cause of accident, injury, claim, cost. Why is that the case? Well, I think it's because, as you said, Colin, people don't understand why these things are happening, and therefore they'd rather that there were fewer accidents, and they probably think at a board level that they're doing what they can to make it better, but actually they're not. They don't really understand it, and therefore they're not doing the right things. When you've been JD in sort of senior roles, is that something you've tried to do? Is kind of get under the hood, as it were, and really break down those silos?
Absolutely, and in two ways. So if we start at the kind of the C-suite level, one of the biggest barriers I've seen is the lack of vulnerability, or the lack of being prepared to be vulnerable from directors other than maybe a HR director. So, for example, and it might have been construction. I've not really been in there, but leisure, hospitality, logistics, and the like. For an IT director, for a finance director, and other directors who typically would have been office-based well before COVID, they've risen to the top. They're very successful in their career. They're at the top of their game. They know what they know. And they're used to an office environment. They're probably not very familiar with actually being out on the front line. So being in a logistics site with forklift trucks racing around, or being on a construction site, they're probably not used to being out there. And to go out there to really understand how work is being done, and to show some leadership around safety risk, given that they have signed, they've signed the safety policy because they're supporting the CEO who has signed the safety policy. What they then have to do is be vulnerable to come into a situation and say, I'm not the expert here. I don't know how you do this. Can you please show me what you do and what support you might need? Now, for me, that would be liberating, because you can go in there and ask the question, but that requires a vulnerability, because you're showing that you don't know, and that can be quite challenging for them. When I've offered to say to board members to come out before, they've said, well, can you give me an aid memoir? Can you give me 10 questions to ask? And I said, well, I prefer not to, because that's just another audit. I don't want to give you an audit. I want you to show that you care. I want you to show an interest. One of the things that I did that was very effective was for RIDDOR or accidents, as some of you know, certain types of accidents and incidents you have to report to a local authority or HSE. What I said was, from now on, every time we have one of these types of incidents, I'm looking for a nomination, I'm looking for a volunteer on the board to come and spend some time with my team member in the health and safety department, who will talk you through the investigation, and let's see what we can do to show you a bit more about what's going on and how this happened. And we did this in one organisation, and the procurement director actually got involved. Because the procurement, and this was to do with housekeeping, so because the procurement director understood what had happened, how this lady had been injured, what he's able to do was to change the specification for all new equipment that was going to be used. So for new build and for refurbishments, he could change the procurement spec overnight. So that's way more impact than the health and safety department doing an investigation and making a recommendation. The other way is actually getting the health and safety teams collaborating in the organisation. So on day one, somebody would join my team. I wouldn't get them to read the risk assessments and the policies and procedures to know what we're supposed to do as a team. I'd say go and meet people. Go and walk around head office. Go and find out where the communications teams sit. Go and find out where the HR department sit. Get invited to their team meetings, and also bring other people to our team meetings as well. So this getting that glue, and as James asked a question about communication, the biggest part of that is creating an environment where people can learn from each other and collaborate. And then you use the language as everyday language. You don't find yourself talking about risk assessments. You find yourself talking about, so how do you do that then? What new system are you getting for HR? Oh, a new payroll system. I wonder if we can piggyback on that with some of our systems.
Yeah.
I don't know how that compares with Colin and Matt in your experiences.
I think you're right with what you're saying there, JD, and but I suppose the real beauty would be as if, rather than waiting for the incident to happen, the people are going out into the workplace and having those discussions about how the job's done, and to find out how the job's done. And and unfortunately, what happens is that just because somebody's got to a senior position in a business doesn't necessarily mean that they are a great communicator, and it doesn't mean that they're comfortable with it. And and asking people to go and do something that they feel uncomfortable with, then you're not going to necessarily get a great response. And what I see happens an awful lot in business is people are given these targets to go and do 4 safety tours a month or whatever it may be, and they're going out and they end up I always say, as you're walking away from the person that you've just had a chat with, how are they feeling? And if they're feeling that was a really, really worthwhile exercise, then you have done something really positive. However, if they're feeling, well, he's a bit of a twat, I'm not going to say that live. Anyway, I've said it.
We had worse words than that earlier.
Yeah. But if that's what somebody's saying as you're walking away, then you're better off staying in the office. You're better off. But that actually isn't what you want to be. You want to be able to go out, and some people struggle with that, and we shouldn't again criticize people for that. What needs to happen then is that's where the investment needs to be made into getting people more comfortable with going out and talking and discussing.
Yeah. I mean, I think just to answer the overarching question about who does or who should, I believe that, and it's difficult until you get to a certain size, but I think there should be a risk management function to try to cut through some of these silos, basically. I think it's not for safety to manage all of these risks. It's not for finance to manage them all. It needs somebody that can wear different hats and bring it all together. So that's how I think people should try to square this circle.
I think one thing I just wanted to raise, and I don't know whether it's in relationship, I think the conversation we're having is there's sort of I think a lot of people focus on the sort of the low probability, high consequence event, killing somebody on a warehouse or whatever it is. But then there's the attritional losses like yours, Christian, which is how many people in our workforce are we losing to slips and trips every month, and how long are we losing them for, and what's it costing us, which both of them are not acceptable, but one will capture people's attention far more than the other probably. But both of those things need to be managed. We need to understand them, and we need to, so just because something is sort of medium probability, medium risk or whatever, it doesn't mean to say that it should just be ignored, but I think we tend to focus on the red stuff on the risk register, and then the kind of the amber stuff just gets left, but that's probably where most of the cost is.
And also, I think from an employee engagement perspective, I'm not going to say they don't care about the catastrophic stuff, because of course they care about it, but actually the attritional stuff probably affects them more. So you probably get more of a negative impact in terms of performance and engagement and kind of feeling loved and feeling protected with all of these things happening all the time than you do with one, very catastrophic thing, because actually people inherently understand that, as we said before, accidents will happen and bad things are going to happen occasionally, but it's when you kind of see again and again and again and again things happening. I think that's when morale.
The link for me, Christian, is if you look into a lot of these big spectaculars, it's the absence of process around the granular detail that leads to the tragic outcome, which is the big spectacular, that whether it's Grenfell, Piper Alpha, you name it.
Yeah.
If the basics had been being done routinely, the likelihood is we wouldn't have had that huge tragic event.
Yeah.
And then obviously, but most of those don't end up in a public inquiry, and you don't get to see all the granular detail. But that block of flats that burnt down, well, the fire brigade couldn't get in time because they were trying to hoof the doors in, or the lifts didn't work, or the risers weren't working, or whatever it was, that would be buried in an incident report, but probably wouldn't get out into the public domain. So therefore you just think, oh, that's terrible, there's a block of flats that had a fire and it burnt down. You wouldn't necessarily know why. So I think that's the real key thing, that just having that debate, I think, at board level, and sort of understanding that just because it's highly improbable doesn't mean to say it's something you should just ignore.
I think as well, it's about not necessarily seeking perfection. I mean, we're always, when reports come out, you see them all. There was a report came out and it had 1,157 recommendations. So what? You know what I mean? That's almost a pointless report. But there are things in there, as you're saying, Matt, that are so critical. And it's the same with say with a risk assessment. You'll have a series of controls that are part of doing a job. There's some real key ones. There's some real critical things in that particular process that we really need to make sure are in place. And this is where the resilience comes in. And and if people make mistakes, they can make mistakes and they can fail, but they can fail in a safe environment rather than fail in an environment where they actually end up getting hurt or seriously injured. So don't seek perfection, but just seek out the things that are really key.
Absolutely. Christian, I'm conscious we're getting towards the end. Are there any other comments coming in? And maybe we can encourage the audience to maybe put forward suggestions for topics for coming weeks in terms of things that they'd like us to go into maybe a bit more depth on some of the things we covered today, or maybe some other areas.
Yeah, that's a good idea. There's no other specific questions that have come up, but yeah, absolutely. If anybody's got any thoughts, and even if you're watching this on a replay, drop it in the comments, or send me a message or something. And other than perhaps not having the Zoom as an open link to let any idiots log in and use profanities, what we could talk about next week. I don't know about you guys, but I feel as if I found it personally more engaging doing it on Zoom than on Clubhouse. I think it's useful to be able to actually see each other, and actually I think whilst Clubhouse is good because it's democratizes speech, the conversation, I think, often doesn't flow because you're kind of almost waiting for the mute button to go off or on, whereas here you can sort of take the visual cues as well.
Yeah, I've had a lot of Zoom fatigue, so having had a few weeks off of Zoom, coming back today, I've definitely found it good today. I think with the Clubhouse, though, a lot more people can engage in the conversation.
Yeah.
Around the world as well. So I think the fact that we've got both, and of course we can have different audiences in different places. I think at the moment our audiences who are engaging around risk and safety aren't really on Clubhouse yet, because we're early adopters in that respect. So a combination of the two, I would suggest. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay. Well, let's wrap it up then, guys. We've had some good engagement. We've had some people watching us, which is good, and a few gate crashes. But any comments, any suggestions for next week? Feel free to reach out to any of us, and we can start putting that together. Did you want to do a quick wrap up, JD?
Yes, grateful to our friends and guests. Covered some ground today. I think I'd like to think we've put a positive frame around risk. The fact that it is something we can bring lots of different experiences to. Everybody in every organisation has a role to play, and everybody can start to think differently. And it's largely by being curious and being open to have those conversations. There's lots of cultural context. There's lots of time pressures, lots of the pressures, but I think we've covered a lot of ground on here today. Certainly encourage you to reach out to us and share some more conversations. And if we hand over to Colin and Matt just to sum up from their experiences of today.
Okay, I'll go. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to come and have a chat. I thought it was a great question. And it was nice to hear the people's opinions and views around the group. And I think my sort of closing line is is if you really want to find out how businesses work, then go out and talk to the people that are doing the job, and that's the thing for me.
we've had a few thanks and stuff on the chat, and Chris Shaw, to answer your question, we're planning to do this every week. So every week at 11 on a Wednesday, we're planning to do this for the foreseeable future.
Okay, no, thanks everybody. I really enjoyed it. I'm just conscious earlier I did bang on about diversity and the irony of 4 middle-aged white guys being on the screen.
Hey.
We have talked about that, and we will be addressing that issue. But we've got to start somewhere. So yeah, I think the more the merrier that can come forward. I think if people can put their names forward for maybe joining the panel, and
yeah, well, we might try. What we might try is, rather than opening it up, we might invite people to join. Or people could always message and say, can I join, or something like that. But I might look middle-aged, Matt, but I'm definitely not. I'm not even 39 until June. Just because I look 50.
I was say you don't look 39, Christian, but you used to. But you used to.
Male, pale, and stale.
I think there was a certain amount of excitement about the people that were coming up who we knew nothing about.
There was. Yeah. There must be a good solution for this, but I don't know what it is. So we'll figure it out, guys, for coming weeks.
Brilliant.
We have a risk that we need to manage. So
yes.
Let's go away and talk about it. But
exactly.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's been great.
All right, great. Well, I'll stop the stream, and thanks everyone for watching. And do, as I said at the start, do give Colin, Matt, and Jonathan a follow if you're not following them already, or me if you're not following me. And we look forward to seeing you guys all next week for some more chatting about safety and risk.